The year was 1816. Across the world, the weather had turned against humanity. In Europe, snow fell in June. In New England, rivers froze solid in August. In China and India, monsoons failed, and millions faced starvation. People stared at the sun and saw it dim, a pale disk behind a veil of haze. The sky had changed. The seasons were broken. It was as if the earth itself had stopped breathing. No one knew why. No one yet understood that half a world away, a mountain had exploded with a force not seen in thousands of years. Its name was Tambora. At the dawn of the 19th century, the world believed it was entering an age of light. Empires spanned oceans. Science and reason had triumphed over superstition. Steam engines hissed, factories rose, and cities glowed with new ambition. Napoleon had been defeated just a year earlier at Waterloo. Europe was exhausted but optimistic. For the first time in decades, farmers could sow in peace. Merchants could trade freely, and families could plan for a future without war. But deep in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, an invisible threat stirred beneath the ground. On the island of Sumbawa stood a great mountain, 10,000 feet tall, known to locals as Gunung Tambora. For centuries it had slept. By 1812 it began to murmur. Villagers heard thunder that came from the earth. Streams turned black with ash. Birds fled. At first no one understood what was happening. Then, in April 1815, the world changed forever. On the evening of April 5th, the first eruption began. Witnesses aboard British ships hundreds of miles away reported hearing a distant cannonade. They thought a naval battle was raging somewhere over the horizon, but this was no war. It was the earth itself declaring war on life. On April 10th, Tambora erupted again, this time with unimaginable fury. The entire mountain seemed to ignite. A column of fire and ash shot 25 miles into the stratosphere. The roar could be heard nearly 2,000 kilometers away. The night sky turned red. Pumice stones the size of fists rained down. Lightning flashed inside the cloud, illuminating the mountainside as villages vanished beneath avalanches of molten rock and ash. In less than 24 hours, the top of Tambora collapsed. A crater 7 kilometers wide and more than 1,000 meters deep was left behind, an open wound in the planet's crust. The island of Sumbawa was obliterated. Entire kingdoms, Tambora, Pekat, Sanggar, disappeared. 40,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more perished in the weeks that followed from starvation and disease. Ships passing through the Java Sea found the ocean covered in floating ash and corpses. The air smelled of sulfur for months, and then the winds carried the dust higher, into the upper atmosphere, where it began its silent journey around the world. By the time the news reached Europe, the connection was invisible. No one could imagine that an explosion in the tropics could dim the skies of England or freeze the farmlands of America. But Tambora's ash had entered the stratosphere, 30 kilometers above the Earth, where it would stay suspended for years. Sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form a veil of aerosols. That veil encircled the planet, scattering sunlight and turning blue skies to grey. Daylight took on a copper hue, twilights glowed an unnatural red. And slowly, the world began to cool. At first it was subtle. A late frost here, an unseasonable chill there. But by the next spring, farmers knew something was terribly wrong. In 1816, the climate collapsed. In North America, the summer that never came began with snow in May. In Vermont, 1/2 meter of snow buried crops overnight. Farmers watched helplessly as the corn blackened and died in the fields. The price of oats, vital for feeding horses, rose tenfold. Families abandoned their farms and migrated west in desperation. In Europe, the situation was even worse. Rain fell without end. Cold fogs drifted across the valleys. The Rhine flooded its banks and destroyed entire harvests. In Switzerland, peasants boiled grass and ate their last livestock. Bread riots broke out in the streets of Paris and London. The poor starved, while the wealthy hoarded what little remained. In China and India, the altered monsoon patterns brought the opposite disaster: drought. The rice crops failed. Famine spread. In Bengal, the heat mixed with stagnant floodwaters to breed a new disease: cholera. Within a few years, it would spread across continents, killing millions. Everywhere, the world seemed cursed. No one could explain it. Scientists argued that sunspots were to blame. Preachers warned of divine punishment. Ordinary people spoke of the apocalypse. But the truth was simple and silent. A mountain on the other side of the earth had exploded, and the sky had not yet forgiven us. The year 1816 was a year without light. Across the Northern Hemisphere, it became known simply as the year without a summer. But to those who lived through it, it felt like the end of the world. For months, the sun hung in a pale haze. Days looked like twilight. At night, the moon was blood red, and stars were hidden behind a sulfur mist. Birds stopped singing. People spoke of a permanent dusk. In the villages of France and Germany, farmers looked at their frozen fields and wept. The wheat never grew. Cows starved in their stalls. The few potatoes that survived were hoarded like gold. Children cried from hunger, and families boiled weeds and bark for food. In some towns, entire populations fled into the forests, searching for anything edible. The famine spread quickly. In Switzerland, one of the worst-hit regions, lakes overflowed from endless rain and snow. Mountain passes became impassable. Merchants could no longer bring food into the valleys. People ate their last animals, then their leather boots. In the city of Basel, desperate citizens smashed bakery windows and stormed granaries. The Swiss government sent soldiers to guard flour shipments. Even they could not feed everyone. In Britain, newspapers printed headlines like, "Bread unaffordable, the poor perish in the streets." Londoners queued for hours for a loaf that cost a week's wages. In Ireland, hundreds of thousands starved as their crops rotted under black rain. Across Europe, typhus spread through the refugee camps that formed along roadsides and city gates. The world was collapsing again, this time not from war, but from weather. In North America, the story was no better. The cold swept across New England like a curse. Snow fell in June, and lakes froze in July. Farmers abandoned their land in despair, driving oxen westward toward the Ohio frontier in search of fertile soil. Entire communities vanished almost overnight, leaving behind broken fences and empty barns. It was in this bleak migration that the modern American frontier was born. The failure of the East drove settlers into the wilderness, founding the towns that would one day become the Midwest. The hardship of 1816 became part of the myth of American endurance, the idea that survival itself was a kind of victory. But not all responses were heroic. In Europe, famine brought out both generosity and cruelty. Charities sprang up in cities, feeding lines of starving families with thin soup and bread crusts. Yet others profited from misery. Grain merchants hoarded supplies to drive prices higher. Peasants rioted, looted, and burned warehouses. In parts of Germany and France, the famine turned into class war. The old order, already shaken by the Napoleonic Wars, began to crumble under hunger and rage. Governments sent troops to suppress the riots, but soldiers themselves went unpaid and unfed. In the chaos, entire units deserted to steal food. The same continent that had once fought over empire now fought simply to survive. And still, the sun refused to shine. In the journals of the time, the sky is described as leaden, ashen, and suffocating. The sunsets were beautiful, but terrifying. blood red and gold, streaking across the clouds like fire. Artists tried to capture it, but no one could. The air itself seemed poisoned. In England, a young painter named J.M.W. began sketching the strange colors of the sky. Years later, his haunting, fiery landscapes would be recognized as the first visual record of volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere. He didn't know it, but Tambora had painted his sunsets. Far away on the shores of Lake Geneva, the cold summer of 1816 trapped a small group of writers inside a rented mansion. Among them were Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his young wife, Mary Shelley. The lake was frozen with mist. Lightning split the sky over the mountains. Byron called it a season of darkness and tempest. To pass the time, they held a contest. Each would write a ghost story. In that unnatural darkness, Mary Shelley conceived a tale of science and death, a story of a man who created life, only to be destroyed by it. She called it Frankenstein. It was born from Tambora's shadow, the first modern work of science fiction, created during a global climate catastrophe. But even as the arts flourished in tragedy, millions were dying in silence. In Asia, the changed monsoons brought hunger on an unimaginable scale. In Yunnan, crops failed for 3 straight years. Tens of millions across China and India faced famine. Starvation was followed by epidemic disease, cholera, carried by polluted waters and malnutrition. Within a decade, cholera would spread across the world, first through trade routes, then through armies and ships. It became the first true modern pandemic, reaching Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and America. All of it traced back, in one way or another, to the invisible ash veil that Tambora had left in the sky. Scientists of the era struggled to understand what had happened. Meteorology barely existed as a science. Some blamed comets or volcanic exhalations. Others claimed the Earth's orbit had shifted or that a great solar storm had dimmed the sun. The real answer would not be confirmed until more than a century later, when ice cores revealed the fingerprints of the eruption, layers of sulfur frozen into the polar ice, identical to those of 1816. The people of that time never learned why their world froze. They only knew that it had, and that nothing could be done. By the winter of 1817, the worst had passed. The air began to clear, and sunlight slowly returned. But the scars of the disaster remained etched into every continent. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 people died directly from famine, and millions more from the secondary effects: disease, migration, and economic collapse. For those who survived, the memory lingered. They spoke of it for decades as the dark year, the cold year, or 1800 and froze to death. The phrase became folklore, passed down through generations. The eruption of Tambora had shown the modern world what its ancestors in 1258 had already learned: that civilization, no matter how advanced, still lives at the mercy of the planet. When the skies finally cleared, the survivors of 1816 stepped into a changed world. The frost had broken, the rains had slowed, and the light had returned. But the world that emerged from that cold, grey year was not the same one that went into it. It was harder, wiser, and forever aware that the planet could turn against it at any moment. Across Europe, fields slowly came back to life. The first green shoots of grain pushed through the blackened soil. In America, settlers on the frontier planted new crops in richer lands. In Asia, the monsoons returned to their rhythm, and rice once again filled the paddies. But the memory of the hunger stayed. It would be told again and again, as a warning that nature, not empires, still ruled the earth. The devastation had reshaped everything: politics, migration, and even science. In England, the agricultural reforms that followed the famine led to the first modern efforts to store grain and breed hardier plants. In France and Germany, Meteorological societies formed to record rainfall, temperature, and sky conditions. The world had learned, painfully, that understanding weather was not a curiosity. It was survival. For the first time, nations began keeping daily temperature logs and recording cloud patterns. From this quiet revolution, the science of meteorology was born. The disaster also gave rise to the modern concept of climate. Scientists began to suspect that the Earth's atmosphere could change on a global scale. It was a radical idea, that weather could be planetary, not local, that the sky over Indonesia could decide the fate of Europe. It was Tambora that proved this truth. Yet for the millions who had endured the darkness, explanations came too late. Their lives had been shaped not by discovery, but by endurance. The world moved on, but it carried the marks of Tambora in its art, its literature, and its imagination. Painters like Turner filled canvases with burning skies, those eerie, blood-orange sunsets that haunted their childhoods. Writers like Byron and Shelley carried the mood of despair into poetry and prose, transforming natural catastrophe into human meaning. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster's creation and rejection mirrored humanity's own fragile relationship with the forces of nature. It was not just a ghost story. It was a reflection of a world that had seen itself become both creator and victim. In time, the volcano was forgotten. Sumbawa returned to jungle, the crater filled with mist. Travelers who came centuries later saw only a quiet mountain and the peaceful blue of the sea. But deep in that crater lay the evidence of the most powerful eruption in recorded history. 160 cubic kilometers of rock had been blasted into the sky, enough ash to bury all of Europe under a blanket 5 inches thick, enough energy to alter the global climate for nearly 3 years. When scientists finally connected the dots in the 20th century, when they realized that the cold year of 1816 and the eruption of Tambora were the same event, the story of the year without a summer became not a legend, but a lesson. It is a lesson we are still learning today. Tambora showed how fragile the balance of life is, how one event, far beyond human control, can ripple across continents and rewrite history. But it also showed something greater, the stubborn, relentless will of humanity to survive. From the ashes of one of the darkest years in history came migration, innovation, art, and science. From famine came foresight. From suffering came understanding. Every generation since has lived in a world shaped, in some small way, by that disaster. The maps we draw, the cities we build, the data we record, all trace their origins to the realization that nature is vast, and we are small. Today, as we face our own age of instability, of warming, storms, and uncertainty, the echoes of 1816 grow louder. We understand more about the planet than any civilization before us, yet we are just as vulnerable to its moods. The lesson of Tambora is not fear, it is humility. For all our power, we still live beneath the same fragile sky that once went dark. And it can happen again, in our lifetime or in the lives of our children. Somewhere on the Pacific Rim, another mountain sleeps. Its heart beats slowly under stone. One day it will wake, and when it does, the question will not be whether the Earth survives. It will be whether we have learned enough to endure it again. The eruption of Tambora changed the world. It created famine and fear, art and science, tragedy and renewal. It reminded us that history is written not only by kings and empires, but by mountains and skies. The year 1816 was not the end of the world. It was a reminder of how easily it could be. The year without a summer, when the sun vanished and the earth remembered its power.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's incredible histories.